we're now going to pivot to a conversation about renewable energy, which it really sits very often at the heart of the narrative about why Kenya is in a position to be a really distinctive player, both in Africa, but then broadly globally, just given the role that renewable energy in different forms is playing in the economy and its potential to do even more. We'll hear from 4 voices in this next conversation, drawing from the worlds of policy, infrastructure and utilities, the world of biomass, as well as the off-grid and off-grid solutions, and really what the opportunity is, not just to recognize what is happening today, but actually in line with the goal of this conversation, raising the climate ambition. And so with that, I'll start with Eric Mwangi. And Eric, you are a senior advisor in the Ministry of Energy. I can't think of anyone better placed to weigh in and give us a little bit of a big picture on where we are today. Kenya is a world leader in renewables as a share of our grid, one of the highest shares of grid composition in the world, as Nigel also acknowledged. But we must recognize that's off a relatively small base, not bad for our neighborhood, but not much by global standards. And so what kinds of ideas and interventions should we be looking at if we're serious about driving real scale and real global significance in this aspect of the Kenya climate story?
Thanks, James. I think just in terms of situating where Kenya is from a renewable energy perspective, we've got about 10 gigawatts geothermal capacity estimated, about 10 to 20 gigawatts of wind potential, and between 25 and 30 gigawatts of solar. Now, as we sit today, we've got an installed capacity of just over 2,800 megawatts. Around about 2,000 of that would be renewable across the different technologies. And as we sit today, if we look at the capacity that's coming into the system, we have about 2,800, just over 2,800 megawatts of committed new capacity coming in across hydro, geo, solar, and wind. And another probably just over 3,000 megawatts that hasn't been committed to in terms of, PPAs have not been signed, but projects are in various stages of development. So there is a growing sense that that we are moving towards scale. But kind of on the flip side, there are some arbitrage opportunities that perhaps present themselves in the short term. If you look at the most recent least cost power development plan, which is really the roadmap for energy development for the country, we estimate that about 166 gigawatt hours of geothermal capacity was actually vented. So basically, we couldn't take it into the system. And the steam was vented, and the estimate for 2021 is about just under 1,400 gigawatt hours. And this is not a story someone like Rebecca would likes to hear, because it's basically lost value for the system, for the electricity system in Kenya. If we think about just that in terms of what can we kind of take a high level look at what the lost opportunity is. So if we look at the 1,400 gigawatt hour number, you're talking about a potential of between 25 and 30,000 tons of hydrogen a year that we're actually saying could be produced now. And I think that we're getting to a point where we need to take a step back and relook at the opportunities that present themselves in the world that we're moving to. And I see them along a number of dimensions. I think you have issues of mobility, so public transport. I think you have probably about 3 or 4 major European countries that have come out with their hydrogen strategies. And countries like Germany have actually committed, significant amounts of capital. I think it's 2 billion euro to developing global partnerships. So I think if one of the things that I think is would be important to consider is to say, as from a policy and regulatory point of view, what is it that needs to be done to start to align with the direction in which we see important global countries going? And it's not just Germany. You have the EU itself. You have the Netherlands. You have Japan. I think Japan is decommissioning 50 gigawatts of nuclear in the coming years. And they'd like to replace a lot of that with hydrogen power plants. So, we are moving into a universe where the demand for, renewable energy will far exceed the supply available globally. And that, given the fact that Kenya is emerging as a renewable energy powerhouse, I think that is a good long-term place to be. I think the one thing that I believe will be required as a bridge to us getting into that new world in which we're going is we need to come up with develop more creative financing instruments to bridge that period, and become perhaps a little bit less reliant on long-term offtake agreements and letters of support, because I think the dynamism that we are seeing now globally provides room for that, and it will make it put less risk on the public sector to underwrite these long-term contracts, and just come up with a better risk allocation framework. I think I'll give the example. So just want to give a quick example, and I'll stop. I think in Chile, they actually have a pilot wind plant called Haruoni, where they are effectively exporting e-methane to Germany with Porsche as an off-taker. And the electrolysis is basically done on site, and they plan to do about 55 million liters a year in the next 2 to 3 years. So I think there are folks who are actually doing stuff, and we can look at some of these examples as beacons. Thanks.
Fantastic, Eric. And really, what I love about that is the way that you're raising the ambition on the demand side. I think we know that there's a lot of potential on the supply side, but really, how do we think about driving demand, recognizing there's a lot of demand in country, but also how do we begin to unlock bankable demand that can actually accelerate that scaling up, and unlock the financing that's needed. I think, having talked a little bit about demand, you touched on the fact that, Rebecca, turning to you, there's also a lot that it has already happened and could happen on the supply side. As you think about KenGen's ongoing journey as a primary source of that supply, what is already in the works and progressing, and where do you see the biggest potential?
Thank you, James, and thank you, the organizers, for inviting me to participate in this distinguished forum. And like Eric has said, Kenya has made very remarkable progress in harnessing renewable energy, except that when I Google the top countries in percentages for usage of renewable energy, I see the highest countries that are mentioned are about 12%, but Kenya is 90%. So I believe one day that will be amended and will be in the record. But going back to what we have done, we are number 8 globally in developing the geothermal resource, and the first one in Africa. And so currently 45% of our generation is from geothermal sources, about 35% from hydro. Then we have some wind and some solar, and that's why in aggregate we are about 90%. And this has been tremendous growth especially from the year 2008, when we changed our strategy and became more innovative in accommodating the renewable energy strategy. And in that regard, we have seen the geothermal installed capacity grow exponentially from 115 megawatts to the current 706 megawatts. And we are also working on other projects. And James, I want to tell you that our project pipeline going forward for the next 10 years is all renewable energy. And so the projects we are working on are compliant with that. And I believe with the potential that we have in this country, more than 10,000 megawatts of geothermal, 5,000 of wind, and so on, and that data has already been given. I believe that Kenya is in a position in the future to have all its energy from renewable sources, and that's a big achievement, and we see that that is the ambition of the government. But also as Kenyan in the future, we believe that it is important for the whole of Africa, which is a whole renewable energy giant, to be able to generate from renewable sources. And we have expanded our territory, and we are supporting the region. The countries that are located within the Rift Valley all have geothermal potential, but they haven't been able to extract and develop that resource. So we are working in Ethiopia. We have recently gone into Djibouti. We are having some discussions in Rwanda, because our mission will not be fulfilled until the whole of Africa then just utilizes the potential that it has in providing renewable energy. Thank you, James.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And you add another angle on the question of ambition in terms of thinking not just as about Kenya within its own borders and the opportunity we have here, but also as an entry point to a broader African renewable energy story. Now, I will say, as I turn to you, Note, that very often this part of the Kenyan renewable story captures a lot of, it is now getting a bit more attention, just the role of electricity and renewable electricity in particular. But I'm often surprised, just looking at the numbers again, about when you think about Kenya's overall energy mix, not just its electricity mix, on how big a role biomass plays. And biomass, given your work with Tamua, is where you spend your time. And I wanted to get your sense, based on your engagement with industry users of biomass, what is the sort of potential that exists in this space to move to a more renewable set of solutions and approaches, and how do we unlock those opportunities?
Super. Thanks, James. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. And thank you to the organizers. Indeed, the biomass space is a super interesting space, because 70% of all primary energy in Kenya today is being derived from burning wood. So the sheer scale just tells you that there's a lot of work we can do in this sector. And of course, it has huge potential to really move the needle on climate action, if you want to put it. One example, you mentioned the industrial area or sector. And of course, any industrial complex you go to in Kenya, if you go to the back, you'll see more often than not, there'll be a boiler there, and more often than not, they will be burning wood. So of course, it's a huge thing in Kenya. Kenya burns more than 40 million cubic meters of wood every year, and a significant portion of that is non-renewable. And of course, we know the state of the forest covers. So of course, a very hot topic. Needs a lot of change, but there has been a lot of action over the last couple of years in the space, because there was a logging ban introduced by the government in February of 2018, which I think was very welcome for everybody in the space. At Tamua, we've been focusing on building our capacity for upcycling agricultural waste into what is a cost-effective renewable biomass fuel. The interesting thing with, I think, the solution that we bring to the table is that you can use this fuel and switch directly with wood without having to do any lengthy or expensive infrastructure upgrades. So essentially zero capex, and you can switch tomorrow. with regards to adaptation, as Dr. Julius Mue pointed out to us early on, everybody will fight, will have a resistance to change, and a mindset change can be lengthy. So a lot of the time that we spend is actually educating the market, educating our customers with regards to the benefits of using sustainable biomass fuels, from firstly a climate change perspective, but also from a cost competitive point of view as well. Because you will find that if you are using your fuel efficiently, swapping out 100% or 50%, there are significant savings that you can make in using the fuel as well. We believe the sector now, specifically in the industrial area, James, is coming to a tipping point. There is a number of multinational corporations and large industrials in the midst of swapping. Some have swapped. They are seeing the benefits, obviously, from being sustainable, but also from a cost perspective. So a very exciting time for us in this space. I'll just keep it brief and wrap up by saying that the most important thing we see with trying to swap out some of the non-renewable biomass that is being used in the market today is to be able to preserve the forests, to rebuild forest cover in Kenya, because when we look at what that means in terms of not just CO2 capture, but also the precipitation cycle that drives the agricultural sector in Kenya. The ag sector in Kenya is giving us more than 50% of our GDP. It employs more than 40% of the population and brings in more than 60% of foreign exchange earnings every year. So just a really hot topic. And to sort of conclude, I think it's got huge potential to move the needle. We're working aggressively towards achieving that tipping point for the market and of course for ourselves. And we see huge potential in the change that we can make there. And of course, we feel it's absolutely necessary to make that change too. So yeah, exciting times, and thank you for having us here today. It's an exciting forum. Thanks, James.
Thank you, Niels. And the number there, that's 40 million cubic meters of wood, just really sticks with me as a real opportunity. I know that we'll be pivoting to a conversation about natural capital, and it's interesting to see how these conversations, both the capital conversation just before and this one on renewable energy and the next one on natural capital, they're not distinct. They really interlock with each other in interesting ways. Samir, Kenya is known, 10 years ago, the big story in Kenya was, how it was a leader in mobile money adoption. In more recent times, another story began to really kind of catch the headlines, which was the cutting edge role that Kenyan entrepreneurs or businesses were playing in the adoption of off-grid electricity, often enabled by mobile money, but a range of business models for delivering off-grid solutions. So all of the folks who can't access that amazing potential that Eric described and Rebecca is tapping because they're not yet on the grid, and how they were getting on. Through your business, Sun Culture, you focused beyond the home into agriculture and that intersection between, off-grid energy and productive use. And you've been doing that for a while. I'm going to ask a slightly different question though. I mean, Sun Culture is an exciting story, but given that on the phone we have, and on this call, we have policymakers, development partners, and a whole range of investors, are there any prescriptions from the journey of that particular sector, the off-grid solar sector, for what they could do and how they could make a particular difference in that next stage of raising their ambition?
That's a good question. And thank you for having me. First, I think it's important to understand, for those who don't know what productive use is, why we're talking about it. So productive use is, so taking a step back, 2/3 of the African population live off-grid, 2/3 live in rural areas, and 2/3 are farmers. And most of those people are the same people. So when we talk about off-grid energy, we're mostly talking about farmers. So productive use is using renewable energy to drive productivity for these small farmers, whether that is making more money or being able to do more work or saving money. And when it comes to productive use, the way we see it, water is the first step on that productivity ladder because it's needed for survival. So cooking, cleaning, bathing, drinking, but also the foundation of how farmers make money. So they needed to grow crops and raise animals. So from the work that we do, we've seen that this is really important. And last year was a good example. During the height of the COVID pandemic, 9 out of 10 non-sun culture farmers reported being in a worse financial position, where 8 out of 10 sun culture farmers increased their income. So I think everyone agrees that growing more food locally, increasing rural incomes, and mitigating the use of fuel pumps is a win for everyone. And like you said, the big question is now, how do we scale that? What can people actually do from an action-oriented perspective? From a policymaker perspective, Paul Kavuma earlier said it very nicely. And he talked about VATs and duties, and he said that regarding solar, the taxes and the VAT and duties are releasing a little bit of air out of solar adaptation. And I think it's useful to talk about what can happen if the various taxes, and more significantly VAT, are removed. And speaking from sort of the data that I have about sun culture, without these taxes, we would be able to reduce the monthly payments that our customers make by 26%. And reducing our monthly payments by that amount would increase our total addressable market in Kenya by 100%. It would double our addressable market. And if we look at sort of what that would do in terms of sales velocity, and we draw that out over 5 years, that addressable market would increase again by another 50%. So removing taxes from solar products would increase an addressable market by 150%. And that's really important because affordability is the key driver for any adaptation of any of these technologies. And when we look at what's needed to drive adaptation, we need to think about how do we make it more affordable for a majority of the households. So I think an actionable item for policymakers to do is to actually consider what it would look like for them by removing VAT and duties and kind of playing out the corporate taxes they'd be able to make in the long run. For the funders on the line, and from a donor perspective, I think another way to look at this affordability piece is looking at subsidies. They've been used in every part of the world to solve the problems that we're speaking about. And according to a report that actually Dahlberg and Mercy Course collaborated on, we only need about $96 million of subsidies to get Kenya to food security to meet one of the president's big 4 agendas. So it's not a really big chunk of money. And I don't think that subsidies need to be permanent. I think subsidies are used to reach a certain level of market saturation where farmers understand the benefits of these products, and also convince banks that these are good investments, because from a private sector perspective, all of our debt funding comes from outside of Africa. And we really need this to be a sustainable business with low cost of capital. We really need to sort of involve local banks for that. So I think the summary here is think about affordability and what we can use funding for in order to make that monthly payment for these types of technologies affordable to a broader scope of market.
Thank you very much, Samir. I think very clear and concrete suggestions and recommendations to a range of the stakeholders around the table. Looking through some of the questions that came through in the Q&A, I think there were 2 themes I wanted to put out there, and would love to hear a last comment from each of you. The first is around, I think a lot of people who are listening to this, when you hear it all together, it's actually surprising just how robust a story Kenya has to tell around the potential opportunity in renewables and some of the innovative businesses that are operating in that space. But that story is seldom told as an integrated story that would convince, for example, an institutional investor that an investment in a basket of Kenyan opportunities is really green. So what are you doing, or what can you do to really tell that story from your respective vantage points, so that it's almost about branding Kenya as a destination for capital and interest in this space? And the second point is almost the mirror image of that. A number of people are asking the question, really interesting things happening here. They seem to be applicable across the continent. Neil, the work you're doing, certainly the geothermal work, I think, Rebecca, you're already down that path. But what is the path to doing more of this across Africa? In other words, how are you thinking about your role as a gateway or a launching point into a much broader and fast-growing market of over 1 billion consumers? So I'll start in reverse order. So Samir will come right back to you. You can take one or both of these, but try and stick to 90 seconds.
Sure. These challenges are complicated. All of the work that we're doing is complicated. And as humans, we're not programmed to understand these big, complicated problems. They're long-term. Climate change, for example, is a very slow burning problem. No pun intended there. And I think we need to simplify the story, and we need to show folks the story just needs to be simplified. One of the things that we're discussing with some of our partners is how do we create what we would call a 5 for 5 campaign? So in a number of different sectors, how would we choose, for example, 5 solutions to focus on over the next 5 years? I think that, not saying that this is the perfect way to go forward, but there's so much money looking for ways to be placed into the market, but the number of choices that they have are just too much. And I've noticed that funders are often waiting to make $100 or $200 million investments for the perfect solution and the perfect time. And I think we need to start simplifying, saying like these 5 solutions are working when it comes to climate change or when it comes to access to energy. And these are the 5 solutions that we can invest in.
Great, thanks. Niels, beyond Kenya.
The group, like.
Oh, sorry, I think there was a network issue, Samir, but if you don't mind, I'll throw it over to Niels next. Thank you for that.
James, thank you. Actually, I'd like to pick up the first one as well, the story about what do we do to promote inward investment into Kenya to keep moving forwards at pace. And there's a couple of things I think that I feel are particularly important. The first one, just I think Samir touched on it briefly, is what are the level of investments and what are the targets? And I think that the one thing that there is a gap today, most definitely, is capital reaching SMEs and micro SMEs in Kenya. If you look at the very nature of our economy in Kenya, that's where all the action is. That's where you have entrepreneurs, like that's where all the growth exists. Sure, we have some big capital infrastructure projects that can be funded by the big institutions, but we need to work to connect the dots to get capital into, whether it's different funds or in a different gateway for SMEs and micro SMEs to be able to access that capital to continue to grow. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think absolutely we need to simplify the story and we need to put out the united front. And that comes right back to, I think I've heard it mentioned a few different times this morning with regards to policy and taxation. We're facing the same scenario with importation of machinery ourselves, where all of a sudden there's now VAT on agricultural processing machinery meant to produce renewable energy, which is for me a crazy change. But add that also further onto a mix of how can we have VAT on renewable energy in Kenya when heavy fuel oil, which is one of the most polluting fuels there is no VAT on that. So we've just got to sync up across the board and make sure we have a united message, and investors will begin to rally around that message. But I would also like to say it's very inspiring hearing the stories from, or rather the data from both Eric and Rebecca on what the country is doing. So I think there's a great foundation. We've just got to continue to build on that. Thanks.
Rebecca, you are already thinking beyond Kenya, and you're an anchor part of the story of the level of ambition and how Kenya is different from every part of the world. How are you thinking about those two aspects? You're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you, James, because Kenya was the first to develop its geothermal potential. Just to say that we have the expertise, we have the technology and the experience, and probably other African countries that have not developed their potential are now lucky because they have the potential and the services very near home, cheaper, and much more developed. And so it is an offering from KenGen and from Kenya for other countries to access the technology and the experience that they so much require. So welcome to KenGen and welcome to Kenya.